When Joseph Smith's sons came to Utah in the 1860s, proclaiming that their father had not been a polygamist, it was a big problem for the LDS Church, not least because it undermined the authority of Brigham Young. Joseph F. Smith, the son of Hiram Smith and cousin of Joseph Smith's sons, tried to counter their claims, but quickly realized that there was very little evidence of Joseph's involvement in polygamy. As he later wrote to Orson Whitney, when the subject of plural marriage first came before my mind, I must say I was astonished at the scarcity of evidence. I might say almost total absence of direct evidence upon the subject, as connected with the prophet Joseph himself. So he set out to make some evidence, allegedly interviewing women who had been Joseph's wives or were in any way connected with plural marriage, and taking down their stories, many of which he had legalized as affidavits. If you've ever had the temerity to ask questions about Joseph Smith's involvement in polygamy, you've no doubt heard about these affidavits. These, we are told, are definitive proof that Joseph Smith was a polygamist, for these are sworn testimony, and so they must be the truth. Well, so we are told. But as happens so frequently with the myth of Joseph Smith's polygamy, the facts say something different. While poring through the documents looking into an entirely different problem with the polygamy narrative, I found this note from Joseph F. Smith to Hiram Winters, a justice of the peace in Utah County. It reads, "Dear Brother Winters, I return the enclosed affidavit for the signature of Sister Pratt, and also for the date of the signing, that is, the signing of all of them, whether the 2nd, 3rd, or 4th, and then I can fill up the others. With many thanks for your promptness and attention, I am sincerely Joseph F. Smith." Now, there are several aspects of this note that point strongly towards what we may politely call a less than honest approach from Smith. First, why is Smith apparently collecting all these statements, writing them out himself — most of the early affidavits are in Smith's handwriting — and then having them signed and notarized? Why not just ask the ladies and gentlemen to go to the notary or justice of the peace and give their statements? Surely it would be much stronger evidence if there was a general agreement and uniformity between independently given testimony. But had they given independent testimony, there was the risk, even likelihood, of contradictions, if they had anything to say at all. Joseph F. Smith didn't need a group of people each singing solo. He needed a choir singing what he directed. He was not trying to discover the truth. He had decided what the truth was, and he was creating evidence for it. You'll note that he says that after Mary Ann's affidavits are signed, he can then fill up the others. Why wait? And why this peculiar insistence that both affidavits be signed on the same date, and that it be the 2nd, 3rd, or 4th of September? This careful control seems to indicate a correlated, systematic construction of a narrative, rather than organic and spontaneous provision of testimony. Speaking of the dates, did you notice? Joseph F. Smith wrote this note on 4 September, yet he's telling Winters to put the date of the signature on the enclosed, unsigned affidavit as 2, 3, or 4 September. In other words, the affidavits, which, as you can see, say they were signed on the 3rd of September, could not have been signed on the 3rd, since they were unsigned on the 4th. Smith was encouraging Winters to have Mary Ann sign an affidavit which they both knew contained false information, the date. That's perjury, and Joseph F. Smith, collaborating with them to do it, is conspiracy to commit perjury. Why was the date so important that it's worth committing perjury over? I don't know, but it evidently was. But it gets worse. Mary Ann actually signed 4 affidavits, 2 copies each of 2 documents, one about Elizabeth Brotherton's marriage to Parley, and one about her own. Unlike a great many of Joseph F. Smith's affidavits, which were recorded in 2 books, these were written on paper from at least 3 different sources. Please note the difference in paper lines and edges between the 2 on the right and the 2 on the left. Smith evidently sent these to Hiram Winters not just for signature, but at least in the case of the affidavits about Mary Ann's own marriage, for finalization. You can see that on both the copies of the affidavit about Mary Ann's marriage to Parley, the last digit of the date has been filled in by someone who is definitely not Smith. Most likely it was Mary Ann herself. But did Mary Ann not remember the year when Smith allegedly interviewed her for the affidavit? And yet she apparently had no problem remembering the year that she saw Elizabeth Brotherton married to Parley, even though it was the same day and date she allegedly was married to Parley herself. As you can tell by the cramped writing and lack of spacing, The day of Marianne's marriage to Parley was also filled in later, evidently by Smith. This means that in a best-case scenario, Smith had already decided what the story was and written out the affidavit before he interviewed Marianne, if he interviewed her at all, and he simply left blanks for a couple of details. Even more troubling, Elizabeth Brotherton had signed her affidavit over a month before, on 2 August 1869. But as you can see here, Smith has squeezed in the additional sentence, Mary A. Pratt being sealed at the same time, since Smith evidently did not know the date of Marianne's marriage to Parley when he later wrote out her affidavit. This information must have been added after the document was signed and notarized, making this another example of perjury on the part of Joseph F. Smith. As if that wasn't enough, you can see that the date of the signing was left blank in all of Marianne's affidavits, and was later filled in by either Joseph F. Smith or someone carefully mimicking his handwriting. Note the odd spacing, the difference in ink quality and color in the first 2 affidavits, and the differences in letters, particularly the D's. It's difficult to make sense of all this, so let's lay it out visually in a possible timeline. In late September, early August 1869, Smith interviewed Elizabeth Brotherton and filled out the affidavits for her. On 2 August, the affidavits were signed by Elizabeth and notarized by James Jack. Sometime in mid-August, Smith wrote an affidavit for Marianne to sign, matching Elizabeth's, saying that she witnessed Elizabeth's marriage on 24 July 1869. He also wrote an affidavit for Marianne to sign about her own marriage to Parley, but left the day and last digit in the year blank. This indicates that he had not interviewed her about either affidavit, since it's almost impossible that on being reminded of the date that Elizabeth was married to Parley, she would not remember that she herself had been married to him on the same date. In late August, Smith sent the pages to Marianne. She filled in the year on hers and sent them back with a note that she was married the same day that Elizabeth was. Smith then updated Elizabeth's already signed and sealed affidavits. On 3 September, Marianne signed the affidavits about Elizabeth's marriage. On 4 September, Smith updated the affidavit with the day of Marianne's marriage and sent the affidavits to Hiram Winters for both the signing and date of the signing, giving the options of 2, 3, 4 September. Smith and Winters were in different counties. While it's possible that the note could have gotten to him on 4 September, it's unlikely. So, on either 4 or 5 September, or even sometime after, Hiram Winters and Marianne signed the affidavits. Then either Winters carefully mimicked Smith's handwriting to put the day of 3rd September on all 4, or Winters sent all the affidavits back to Smith with a note that they were signed on 3 September and Smith filled in the day. Undoubtedly, a much more sinister version of events could be told, yet this possible sequence still has Smith with multiple counts of perjury and conspiracy to commit perjury. Later on in his letter to Orson Pratt, Joseph F. Smith said about his quest to build a polygamy narrative, "I am in favor of leaving no vacancies in the foundation walls, but want to see them laid solid. At least so far as the record of facts may be truthfully and consistently made. I quite agree that the record of facts should be truthfully and consistently made, but I doubt that Smith would be pleased with the crumbling edifice that would remain." I can already hear the monogamy deniers. "Actually, these are just dates on a few affidavits. It doesn't mean that the rest of the affidavits are false." Well, the monogamy deniers clearly haven't realized this, but the fact is that when someone is a liar, that means you can't trust them. However, the date of the signatures isn't all we're looking at with the affidavits. Recall that the timing means that in at least some instances Smith was writing out the affidavits before ever talking to the affiants, and adding back details that the affiants never gave into completed affidavits, all so that he could weave a more complete web of documentation to support the origin myth of LDS polygamy. If the affidavits had ever been used as evidence in court, the information I've presented would likely have resulted in Joseph F. Smith being convicted of perjury and conspiracy to commit perjury, and every affidavit he had a hand in would be regarded with deep suspicion, if not outright dismissed. Given the obvious bias, the manufactured nature, and the demonstrable perjury and conspiracy to commit perjury on the part of both Joseph F. Smith and at least 2 accomplices, polygamy affidavits should be regarded as exactly what they are: artificial propaganda manufactured by Joseph F. Smith to provide support for the LDS Church's immensely unpopular practice of polygamy by tying it to Joseph and Hiram Smith, who repeatedly denounced polygamy and fought against it. Weeks before he was murdered, Joseph Smith said of those who were accusing him of polygamy that he could prove them all perjurers. He probably didn't know that would include his own nephew and namesake, Joseph F. Smith.